Hi everyone and welcome back to this huge clay crafting tutorial. In this video, I'll show you how to make 8 different characters using the same starting shape. The idea started when I shared a picture of a mold I was making on Instagram and I asked you guys what you thought it was. To my surprise, there were so many different guesses that I decided I might as well just make them all. Creating a mold makes it a lot easier to make multiple pieces that have the same size and shape. But of course, if you only plan on making one of these, then you can skip this step entirely. First, I'm going to make a blank shape using polymer clay. The color doesn't matter at all here, so I'm actually using a very old pack of clay that was left over from this jiggly slime video. As you can see, the texture is really brittle and hard to work with. I decided to mix in some of this Fimo clay softener and it worked surprisingly well. Some people might be confused why I'm using polymer clay for the mold and air dry clay for the final pieces, and this is just personal preference. I like the heaviness of polymer clay, which I find makes it a bit easier to push into the silicone when making a mold. However, I don't use polymer clay often enough to keep a huge range of colors, so I prefer the flexibility of air dry clay because you can mix your own shades using paint. So feel free to use whichever clay you like working with best for any part of this DIY. Now my basic body shape has been baked and I'm going to turn it into a mold using 2-part silicone putty. Making your own mold is always a bit of a cliffhanger because you never know if there's going to be air bubbles inside. After a lot of trial and error, I find that this method tends to produce the best results for larger shapes. Start with a ball of putty that's at least 30% larger than the shape you want to mold. Hold it in the palm of one hand and then press the molding object inside from the other direction like this. Now place it on the table and check that the base can stay flat. This step is important if you're using liquid molding materials like squishy gel or resin, but slightly less important for clay. I'm really pleased with how this turned out since there are no air pockets and the feet are also clearly visible. I'm using Hearty Soft air dry clay in this video because I had some left over from my clay crafting DIYs and I really want to use this up before it dries out. Homemade cold porcelain clay would also be great for this, and I've linked the recipe down below. It took me a few tries to find the best method for using this mold. Pressing the exact amount of clay inside isn't very effective because you're more likely to damage the shape when taking it out. I found that it was much easier to leave a chunk of clay outside the mold and then use this as a handle to pull the whole thing out. Then you can simply use dental floss or a thread to slice off the piece you need. I wouldn't recommend using a knife to cut this because it'll most likely squash the shape. So I'm starting with a penguin, which is based on the same design from my reversible plushie tutorial. After making the body, I'm pressing a small piece of white clay flat, cutting off one side and then using water to stick this in place. Then I'm simply adding some details with orange clay and then using a toothpick to smooth down the edges. Next up we have the Crewmate, and this one can obviously be made in any color. I'm cutting out the legs using scissors and then sculpting the body to make it slightly taller. Then I'm taking a bit of excess clay to make the backpack. Cut across one side to create a flat surface and then use some water to stick it on. Now make an oval shape out of pale blue clay and cut across one side just like before. Then add a small highlight using white paint, Tipp-Ex or nail polish, and I decided to glaze the faceplate as well. If you want to see more Among Us DIYs, then I have a ton of those linked below. Now let's make Pusheen, and this one is the smallest and easiest clay Pusheen tutorial I've ever made for YouTube. I'm starting with some black and yellow paint to make a warm grey color. Then I'm using the handle of a paintbrush to create the ears. I decided to give her a macaron using these tiny shells which I made years ago. However, you can easily change this to a cookie or a donut, which would be easier to sculpt. Since the macaron shells were made of dried clay, I had to use some glue to stick them on. If you're new to my channel and want to see more Pusheen DIYs, then I've linked all of my videos down below. Before painting on the details, I'm checking the paint shade using a piece of scrap clay. Pusheen has 3 stripes on her head, 3 on her tail, and 2 on her back. Her eyes and mouth are so tiny that I decided to use a toothpick instead of a paintbrush. And now our miniature clay Pusheen is done. For the next DIY, I'm making a chick, and this is probably the easiest one out of all. Just press in some yellow clay, add a beak with orange clay, and paint on 2 dots for eyes. I'm also using blusher to create some cheeks. I had some orange and yellow clay left, so I decided to mix them together to create Gudetama. One of the guesses that came up a lot was egg, so I decided to get a bit more creative and see if I can create a paper clay figure inside a transparent squishy. Gudetama, of course, is the perfect character for this. I'm quite proud of how this turned out, and I actually made a TikTok video dedicated to his butt cheeks. If you want to see that, then just check out my account at Macaroon. After painting on the face, I carefully inserted a toothpick into one foot. This is to hold the piece in the center of the mold while the squishy gel is setting. Unfortunately, there was a problem I never anticipated, which is that paper clay floats out of squishy gel. Even with the toothpick, Gudetama kept popping out, so I ended up placing a heavy object on top and just hoping for the best. I checked on this squishy several times over the next few days, and unfortunately the experiment didn't go as well as I'd hoped. The gel simply didn't want to cure, and I even took it out, cleaned everything off, and tried it again using a different batch. I realized that I made the piece a bit too big, so instead of floating around inside the dome-shaped egg, the head was actually pressing against the bottom parts of the silicone mold. This meant that there was too little space for the gel, and this interfered with the curing process. This is actually the very first time I've experienced Sophie and Toffee's squishy gel not curing, because every other experimental squishy I made using gold leaf, glitter, or pigment have turned out just fine. So I guess it's just one of those things, and I quite like the final result, even though it doesn't look perfect. Moving on to the next one. A lot of people guessed Jigglypuff, but I decided to make Chansey because she's my all-time favorite Pokemon. I also feel that her body shape works better with this mold because it's more of an egg shape rather than perfectly round like Jigglypuff. I'm starting with some pale pink clay, and I'm making 2 teardrop shapes for ears. Then I'm using a knife to cut each one into 3 sections and sticking them on with water. I think I like Chansey so much because her ears remind me of a koala, even though I know that this character is based on an axolotl. Then I'm making an egg and wrapping half of it in dark pink clay. And lastly, I'm adding 2 tiny triangular shapes for arms and painting on the face. Now let's make Eggdog, and if you haven't seen his channel, then you have to go check it out right after this video. The body is incredibly easy since we only need plain white clay. The face, however, is a bit trickier because it has to be painted on freehand. Eggdog's face was made using a texture map of a real Pomeranian, so it appears slightly pixelated. To replicate this effect, I'm starting with a translucent grey colour and painting on the rough facial features. Then I'm going in with a solid black and adding in the details. I think the final result looks a lot like a baby seal, and maybe that's another reason this character is so popular. Last but not least, we're going to make something from Sumikkogurashi. This character is officially listed as a penguin, but it actually reminds me more of a kappa, which is a turtle from Japanese mythology. So a common mistake when making miniature pieces is to use too much clay. To make the tummy here, I'm taking a tiny piece of clay and pressing it flat so it can stick nicely against the body. The same applies to the mouth and hands, and both of these look best if you use a tiny bit less material than you think you need. All the DIYs from this video use very little material, so they're great as budget gifts or if you want to make a lot of them at once. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and be sure to check the description box where I've linked a lot of previous clay tutorials that might be useful. I'm Joanna, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye!